Hello fellow aviators, welcome back to the channel. We discuss all things aviation, and Dube welcoming you back, and happy Heritage Day to all my South African people. Today we're celebrating Heritage Day in South Africa, hence the dress code. We are affirming who we are. We are affirming what we stand for as Africans in our diversity. We are embracing that, and we are taking it out there and saying this is us, this is who we are. So happy Heritage Day to everyone in South Africa today. And even if you're not in South Africa, wherever you are, it's your heritage that you must embrace and celebrate. So happy Heritage Day to you. So what are we discussing today? Today we're discussing a little known aviation tradition which forms part of aviation heritage that happens after an individual goes for their first solo. So what is the first solo? Now the first solo is a very momentous occasion. It's a step of responsibility, because you will recall that until the first solo, the student pilot has been flying with the instructor under supervision. So when they now go on their first solo, it's a time where the instructor has trained the student, has imparted the skills to the student, and the instructor is at the stage where he or she is saying this individual can now commandeer the aircraft on their own, and therefore they're able to then send them on their first solo. So it's the first time that the student pilot will be commandeering the aircraft by themselves as pilot in command. So once the instructor deems the student ready, they will then prepare them for solo, and they will send them on their own. But let's look deeply at the solo exercise. What precedes the solo exercise before we go into the traditions that go with the first solo for any student pilot. Now, before the student is sent on their first solo, obviously certain maneuvers must have been taught and internalized by the student. And once the instructor realizes or comes to a conclusion that I think I've taught the student sufficiently now for them to commandeer the aircraft, they will then choose a fair weather day, just like today. Today is a very fair weather in Johannesburg. They'll choose a weather like this, and then they will go into the circuit with the student, do some maneuvers, come back, do some landing, touch and goes. Perhaps, let's say, after 3 or 4 near perfect landings, because they can never really have a perfect landing, but let's say after 3 or 4 good landings, the instructor will then decide, okay, today he is indeed ready for me to send them solo. And then he will instruct the student to taxi, to land and taxi towards the ramp. And once at the ramp, instructor will come off and instruct the student to go back to the start of the runway, where he will do the preparation of the aircraft and take off and stay in the circuit, do some exercises in the circuit, and then come back and land after that. If all goes well, obviously the next thing that will follow, okay, legalistically the instructor will then sign off that solo on the logbook and endorse it, put a stamp and sign it, and then the student is now authorized to taxi the aircraft solo, to take off with the aircraft solo, after the instructor endorses, as I've just explained. But apart from the legalistic endorsements that must happen, something else happens immediately after the student shuts down the engine upon coming back from his first solo. Now that's where we go into the discussion on the traditions that accompany the first solo. So what rites of passage await the student pilot on their first solo? These will vary from school to school, from country to country. But in the South African perspective, the common one is the water bucket splash. It is very common in South Africa. It's done a lot. But we'll discuss that. The first one I want us to discuss as part of the first solo traditions in aviation is the cutting off of the backside of the shirt of the student pilot once they have landed successfully after their first solo. Where is this tradition coming from? Now notice that this tradition is not necessarily a South African tradition. It is common in the US, for instance. Now legend has it that it comes from the days of aircrafts that where the seats were designed in tandem. So the seats were like following each other like that, student and instructor. So because it was noisy in the cockpit, and this was before the days of radio, so they couldn't really use the intercom to communicate. So if the instructor felt he needed the attention of the student in the midst of all that noisiness inside that little cockpit, the instructor would tug at the back of the shirt of the student pilot who was sitting in front of him, and then the student would then know that the instructor needs his attention, and then the instructor would then be able to communicate with the student. So the tradition of cutting off the tail of the shirt of the student after the first solo comes from the fact that the instructor no longer needs to tuck at the shirt of the student now that he sent the student solo. The instructor has now has confidence in the student. The student has been solo, and therefore will no longer be needing the instructor sitting behind him and tugging at his shirt each time he messes up. So that's how it developed. That's how that particular tradition developed. But it's very prevalent in the US. We don't necessarily do that in South Africa. It's not something that's common here. But what is common in South Africa is the second tradition that goes with the first solo for any student pilot. Now, that's the water bucket splash. Water bucket splash takes many variations. I mean, in some instances, you would just get a water bucket, a bucket of water filled with water and splashed upon you after you've shut down the aircraft, and your instructor has congratulated you on your first solo, on a job well done. You would then be splashed with that water bucket to symbolize, your baptism, your transcendence into and the next level of your aviation training. But it has many variations. In some instances, it could be a hose pipe connected to a water tap, and you can get doused down with that water from the tap channeled through that particular hose pipe. In my particular instance, during my own first solo so many moons ago, what my instructor did, he organized a fire truck from a fire engine from the airport, and it came through. Yeah, as soon as I texted Sierra Hotel Papa and I parked it there, and I came out, the driver of the fire engine was ready there with the horse, and of course he had to not put too much pressure, otherwise I would have been blown away by that thing. So he splashed the water from the hose pipe, more like in a water cannon salute. He did that, and that was how I was drenched during my first solo. So it can take many variations. It can take a bucket full of water being splashed on you. It can take a hose pipe connected to a tap, or as it did in my case, it could be a fire truck that stands a distance from you and directs water at you at an acceptable level of pressure. Or alternatively, some people would grab the student pilot who has just gone solo and throw them into a pool. It depends on the tradition of each school, basically, because this is a moment of celebration. This is a moment of, affirming that this individual can now commandeer the aircraft. The instructor no longer needs to be there for every little movement that the student makes. So there's another rite of passage, a third one that I came across, and it's common in some parts of Europe, in some countries in Europe. But looking at it now, I think it could cause serious problems for whoever partakes in it. It has a potential for causing problems. It has many variations as well. Some involve the kicking of the behind of the student pilot by his or her peers. Another variation includes spanking or slapping the backside of that student. They bend over the wing of the aircraft, and their peers come, and each one just slaps and moves on. Depending on the vibes and the connections that exist in that particular space, in that particular school, this could cause some serious problems, especially in these days of sexual violence and unwanted advances. This could be interpreted in any direction, and it could cause problems for those who partake in it. I wouldn't really encourage people to do that, but if it's their tradition, then I have no intention of pronouncing on their tradition. Let them just continue with it. But as far as I am concerned, I really wouldn't be caught dead, spanking anyone bent over a wing like that. But those are the rites of passage, the various rites of passage that are available for the student pilot who goes on their first solo. It's either they get their pilot shirt nipped at the back, because the pilot, the instructor no longer needs to pull or tug at their shirt to get their attention, because they can now commandeer the aircraft on their own. Secondly, is the common one in South Africa, the water splash, where it could either be done by a bucket, or by picking up the individual, throwing them into a pool, or by organizing a fire truck to come and spray the individual, splash the individual once they land and shut down the aircraft on their first solo. And then there's the third one that I warned you about, that spanking one, not really my favorite. I hope that was an informative video, and for those of you who are still looking forward to doing your first solos, you may know or you may not know that you're going solo. When I went solo, I didn't know that I was going solo that day. My instructor simply told me to, taxi to the ramp, and I taxied to the ramp there. He got off and said, dude, go back in the air, and I went back in the air. And I was like, wow, this is going down. I am going solo indeed, and after I came down, I was splashed down with water. So you may or you may not know that you're going solo. And as a result, if you do know, then you might want to wear a different kind of shirt. Because imagine if they use the American version of this rite of passage and they cut off your shirt and it's your favorite shirt, it will surely mess you up. Or if the water they use is not even clean water, it's dirty water, and it messes up your shirt. So yeah, for those of you who are still pushing towards your first solo, those of you who've just started aviation training, those of you who are aspiring aviators, one day you will get that splash. You will not know the day, but you will get that splash. When you get that splash, it will mean you've now ascended to the next level of your training. You can now commandeer the aircraft on your own. You can now sign yourself off, and off you go to the GF to practice your stalls, to practice your to practice your stalls, to practice your forced landings, to practice your precautionary landings. And I hope you will enjoy that particular moment, because it's a very, very momentous occasion. You need to embrace it. It marks a passage in your life that you will always look back and say, that's the day I really, ascended to the class of people that can commandeer this machine called an aircraft. Now, continue to add those hours, as we always say in this program, that with every hour the cockpit beckons, whether it's an hour of studying, an hour of talking to other aviators, motivating yourself, looking for mentors, being a mentor to other people, studying and writing your exams, whatever it is that you do, keep adding those hours, 1 hour at a time, and surely you shall ascend to the cockpit. Angela Dube here saying, until next time, take care and cheers.